Hello there, and welcome to Deep Sleep Seas. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps the day has been long, or maybe you're simply the kind of person who finds comfort in drifting off to the gentle rhythms of the ocean rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is crafted especially for you. You have nothing to do now but rest. Let your mind settle like sand on a quiet seafloor. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of distant waves. Let your body grow light, as if you're floating weightlessly in warm, sun-dappled water. Because tonight we're not simply exploring the ocean. We're descending into a hidden garden, a realm where flowers sway without stems, where colors bloom without soil, where ancient beings wait patiently in the current, unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Tonight we're discovering sea anemones, living gardens of the reef, creatures so exquisite they were named after terrestrial flowers, yet so alien in their biology that they challenge our very understanding of what it means to be an animal. Soft-bodied polyps crowned with tentacles, anchored to rocks like permanent residents of an underwater neighborhood. Patient hunters armed with invisible weapons, timeless beings that may never truly age. Partners in some of nature's most famous friendships, and tonight you'll learn their secrets, their hidden lives, the slow, quiet rhythms that have sustained them since before the first fish swam, before the first shells hardened, before the continents took their current shapes. Some of what you hear may surprise you. Some may spark curiosity, even as sleep creeps closer. But all of it is designed to carry you gently into rest. One wave at a time, one tentacle at a time, one color at a time. So settle in. Pull the covers close. Let the outside world fade away. And if these stories help you relax, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into the deep. Now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the ocean take you. Let's begin. The sea anemone is older than most living things on Earth. If you could travel back through time, back beyond the age of dinosaurs, beyond the first forests, beyond even the earliest fish, you would still find anemones. Delicate polyps swaying in ancient seas, their tentacles reaching into currents that flowed when the world was unrecognizable. The fossil record reveals their presence stretching back over 550 million years to the late Precambrian period, an era when life itself was still experimenting with new forms, when the rules of survival were being written for the first time in the long history of the planet. These ancient anemones witnessed the Cambrian explosion, that remarkable moment when life diversified into an astonishing array of body plans and survival strategies. They persisted through mass extinctions that erased countless other lineages from existence. They watched as trilobites rose and fell, as the first vertebrates emerged from the water, as continents drifted and collided and drifted apart again. Through it all, the basic architecture of the anemone remained remarkably constant. A simple polyp form, elegant in its efficiency, refined over eons into something that works so well it has scarcely needed to change. Sea anemones belong to the phylum Cnidaria, an ancient group that also includes jellyfish, corals, and the tiny freshwater hydra. The name Cnidaria comes from the Greek word for nettle, a reference to the stinging cells that define this entire lineage. But unlike their jellyfish cousins, anemones exist only in the polyp stage of life. They never develop the free-swimming medusa form, that pulsing bell shape that drifts through open water. Instead, they remain attached, patient, rooted to the substrate, like underwater flowers waiting for the world to come to them. Within the class Amphizoa, which translates beautifully to flower animals, anemones occupy their own order called Actinearia. This order contains over 1,000 described species, though scientists suspect many more await discovery in the deep ocean trenches and remote coral reefs that humans have barely begun to explore. Each species carries its own subtle variations in color, size, tentacle arrangement, and habitat preference, yet all share that fundamental polyp architecture, that elegant simplicity that has proven so successful across such vast stretches of time. What makes their evolutionary story so fascinating is not just their age but their resilience. The anemone body plan has remained fundamentally unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, suggesting that natural selection discovered an optimal solution very early on and saw little reason to alter it. This is not stagnation but rather perfection through simplicity. Every part of an anemone serves a purpose. Nothing is wasted. From the adhesive pedal disc at the base to the crown of tentacles at the top, every structure contributes to survival in a way so efficient that evolution itself has endorsed it across geological epochs. And unlike many ancient lineages that exist today only as living fossils, rare relics clinging to marginal habitats. Sea anemones thrive. They populate coastlines around the world. They cluster in tidal pools where children discover them on sunny afternoons. They anchor themselves to coral reefs in the tropics, adding splashes of color to already vibrant underwater landscapes. They burrow into sandy bottoms in temperate seas. They even colonize the deepest reaches of the ocean, more than 30,000 feet beneath the surface, where sunlight has never penetrated and pressure would crush most living things into oblivion. Their success across such diverse environments speaks to an adaptability that belies their apparent simplicity. Though they lack brains, complex organ systems, and the mobility of most animals, anemones have colonized nearly every marine habitat on Earth. From the frigid waters of the Arctic to the warm shallows of tropical lagoons, from intertidal zones that experience dramatic daily fluctuations in temperature and salinity to the stable darkness of the abyssal plain, anemones have found ways to not just survive but flourish. This evolutionary triumph rests on a body plan, so elegantly simple, it almost seems too basic to work. Yet work it does, and has for longer than trees have existed. Longer than insects have flown, longer than vertebrates have walked on land. The anemone represents one of nature's most successful experiments, a design so fundamentally sound that it has remained essentially unchanged while the world transformed around it countless times. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider that these gentle polyps swaying in tide pools and clinging to coral heads are living links to an incomprehensibly ancient past. They are survivors, time travelers, witnesses to the entirety of complex life on Earth. To understand a sea anemone, you must first abandon the idea that it is a plant. Though it resembles a flower swaying in an underwater breeze, though its tentacles wave like petals catching sunlight through the water column, it is thoroughly and completely an animal. A predator, in fact, one built on an architectural plan so different from our own that it challenges the imagination. Begin at the bottom, where the anemone meets the world. Here lies the pedal disc, sometimes called the basal disc, a flattened muscular foot that serves as the creature's anchor to reality. This disc secretes a powerful adhesive mucus that bonds the anemone to whatever substrate it chooses as home. Rock, coral, shell, timber from a sunken ship, even the carapace of a wandering hermit crab. The bond is strong enough to resist the pounding of waves, the tug of fierce currents, the suction of a predator trying to dislodge its meal. Yet it is not permanent. When conditions demand, when food grows scarce or threats emerge, the anemone can slowly detach, leaving behind a faint trace of its presence and relocating to more favorable ground. Above the pedal disc rises the column, a cylindrical trunk that forms the main body of the animal. In some species, this column is smooth and glossy, almost translucent in the right light. In others, it is covered with specialized structures, tubercles, small wart-like bumps that help the anemone grip bits of shell and gravel as camouflage. Sinkers, tiny pores through which defensive threads can be expelled when danger threatens. The column itself is composed of two cell layers, an outer epidermis and an inner gastrodermis, separated by a gelatinous middle layer called the mesoglea. This three-layered construction gives the anemone both strength and flexibility. The column is not rigid. It cannot be, for the anemone possesses no skeleton in the traditional sense, no bones, no shell, no hard internal scaffolding. Instead, it relies on something far more elegant, a hydrostatic skeleton. The gastrovascular cavity, the hollow space inside the column, fills with seawater. By controlling muscular contractions and keeping the mouth closed to seal this internal ocean, the anemone can make its body rigid or flexible at will. Closing the mouth and tensing the muscles creates a firm, upright column resistant to the push and pull of waves. Relaxing the muscles and opening the mouth allows water to flow in or out, enabling the anemone to inflate when feeding or deflate when resting. This hydrostatic system gives the anemone remarkable control over its shape and posture, despite having no hard parts whatsoever. Longitudinal muscles running the length of the column can contract to make the entire animal shorter and stouter. Circular muscles wrapped around the column like barrel hoops can squeeze to make it taller and thinner. By coordinating these contractions against the incompressible water inside, the anemone can stretch, retract, bend, and position itself with surprising precision. At the top of the column sits the oral disc, a flat surface that contains the anemone's mouth at its center. This mouth is typically a slit-shaped opening, sometimes flanked by grooves called siphonoglyphs, lined with tiny beating hairs called cilia. These cilia create gentle currents that draw water into the gastrovascular cavity, helping to circulate nutrients, oxygen, and remove waste. The mouth serves a dual function in the anemone's incomplete digestive system. Food enters through it. Waste exits through it as well. There is no separate anus, no one-way digestive tract. Everything passes through this single opening, an arrangement that seems primitive, yet functions perfectly well for an animal that has persisted unchanged for 500 million years. Surrounding the oral disc, arranged in one or more concentric rings, stand the tentacles. These are the anemone's glory, its most recognizable feature. The structures that give it the appearance of an underwater blossom. Tentacles vary dramatically between species. Some anemones possess just a dozen stubby appendages. Others boast hundreds of long, graceful tentacles that can stretch several times the length of the body column. The arrangement follows patterns. Multiples of 6 are common, reflecting the anemone's radial symmetry, that wheel-spoke organization where body parts radiate from a central point. Each tentacle is hollow, an extension of the gastrovascular cavity, filled with the same seawater that gives the column its rigidity. Muscles run along the length of each tentacle, allowing it to bend, curl, retract completely into the oral disc, or extend fully to maximize the anemone's reach into the current. The surface of each tentacle is covered with thousands upon thousands of specialized cells called cnidocytes, the stinging cells that make anemones such effective predators despite their sedentary lifestyle. Inside the column, hidden from view, the gastrovascular cavity is divided by radial partitions called mesenteries. These vertical sheets extend inward from the body wall toward the center, though they don't always meet in the middle. The mesenteries dramatically increase the surface area available for digestion and absorption of nutrients. Along the free edges of these partitions hang the gastric filaments, structures coated with digestive enzymes that break down food once it has been subdued and swallowed. The mesenteries also house the anemone's gonads, the reproductive organs that will release eggs or sperm when the time is right. Some species possess additional defensive structures. Acrohagi, specialized inflatable tentacles positioned at the base of the true tentacles, armed heavily with stinging cells and used specifically for combat with neighboring anemones that venture too close. Acontia, thin threads loaded with cnidocytes that can be ejected through the mouth or through special pores in the body wall, creating a sticky, stinging cloud to deter attackers. The anemone has no brain, no centralized nervous system organizing its responses. Instead, it possesses a simple nerve net, a diffuse web of neurons scattered throughout its tissues. This decentralized system allows the anemone to respond to stimuli, to coordinate the firing of stinging cells, to retract when touched, to move tentacles toward captured prey. It is a basic arrangement, yet sufficient for an animal whose life consists of waiting, capturing, eating, and reproducing. Sensory cells detect chemical signals in the water, mechanical touch, changes in light intensity. The anemone may lack eyes and ears, but it is not blind or deaf to its environment. It senses the world in ways we can barely imagine, through chemistry and pressure and the subtle electrical signatures of living things moving through the water nearby. This body plan, so alien and yet so elegant, has served the anemone across countless millennia. It requires no maintenance of complex organs, no heart to pump blood, no lungs to exchange gases, as oxygen simply diffuses through the thin cell layers from the surrounding seawater. No kidneys to filter waste, as cellular waste products diffuse out just as easily. The anemone is stripped down to essentials, a predator reduced to its most fundamental components: attachment, tentacles, stinging cells, digestion, reproduction. Nothing more, nothing less. Simply what works. The anemone's most formidable weapon is invisible to the naked eye, scattered across every tentacle. Concentrated at the tips, but present along the entire length, lie hundreds of thousands of microscopic harpoons, each one coiled like a spring, each one waiting, each one capable of deploying in less than a millisecond, one of the fastest mechanical actions in the entire animal kingdom. These are the nematocysts, the signature weapons of all cnidarians. The reason this entire group of animals earns its stinging reputation. A nematocyst is a remarkable piece of biological engineering. It sits inside a specialized cell called a cnidocyte, itself embedded in the tissue of the tentacle. The nematocyst is a capsule-shaped organelle, a tiny sealed chamber filled with coiled thread and venom. At the top of the capsule projects a trigger, a hair-like extension called a kinetose. This trigger is exquisitely sensitive. When a small animal brushes against it, when chemical signals from prey molecules touch it, when mechanical pressure deforms it, the trigger initiates a chain reaction faster than conscious thought. The capsule explodes open. The coiled thread inside everts with explosive force, turning inside out like a glove being pulled off at incredible speed. The tip of this thread is barbed, a microscopic harpoon that pierces the flesh of whatever triggered it. Once embedded, the thread delivers its payload. Venom flows through the hollow interior of the thread directly into the wound. The entire event, from trigger to injection, happens so quickly that high-speed cameras are needed to capture it. In the time it takes a human nerve impulse to travel a few inches, a nematocyst has already fired, penetrated, and begun pumping toxin. The venom itself is a sophisticated cocktail of compounds. Neurotoxins that disrupt nerve function, paralyzing the prey so it cannot escape. Cytotoxins that damage cell membranes, beginning the process of breaking down tissues. Proteins that cause pain and inflammation. The exact composition varies by species. Some anemones produce venoms mild enough that a human touch results in nothing more than a faint tingling or slight redness. Others create chemical arsenals powerful enough to cause severe pain, tissue necrosis, and potentially lethal reactions in unlucky humans who make contact. Species like the Hell's Fire anemone or certain members of the Sticodactyla genus carry neurotoxins strong enough to require medical attention if stung. Their venom can cause symptoms ranging from intense localized pain and swelling to systemic effects including difficulty breathing, irregular heartbeat, and in extreme cases, complete cardiovascular collapse. Most anemones encountered by casual beachgoers or divers pose little threat, their stings too weak to penetrate human skin or cause more than minor irritation. But the potential is always there, coiled and waiting in those thousands of microscopic capsules adorning every tentacle. Different types of nematocysts serve different functions. The penetrating kind, armed with barbs and filled with venom, are used primarily for predation and defense. But some anemones also possess glutinant nematocysts that produce sticky threads instead of piercing ones. These entangling threads wrap around the legs and antennae of small crustaceans, immobilizing them without necessarily delivering venom. Still other species have volvent nematocysts that coil around setae and other small projections on prey, anchoring them in place. The anemone's arsenal is diverse, adaptable, suited to catching and subduing the particular prey items common in its habitat. Once prey makes contact with the tentacles and triggers a barrage of nematocyst discharge, paralysis typically follows within seconds. A small fish that brushed against those innocent-looking petals finds itself unable to swim. A shrimp caught by probing legs discovers it can no longer flee. The tentacles, responding to chemical cues released by the wounded and paralyzed prey, begin to move. They curl, they contract. Working together like the fingers of a hand, they transport the immobilized meal toward the central mouth. The process is slow but inexorable. There is no urgency in the anemone's movements. The prey is not going anywhere. The venom has seen to that. Not all creatures succumb to the anemone's sting. Some fish have evolved resistance, their scales and mucus providing barriers that prevent nematocyst penetration. Clownfish famously live among the tentacles, protected by a specialized mucus coating that mimics the anemone's own chemical signature, preventing the stinging cells from recognizing them as prey. Some sea slugs not only resist the sting but consume anemones and somehow transfer the unfired nematocysts into their own tissues, incorporating the anemone's weapons into their own defensive system. Even some crabs and shrimp have developed tolerance, allowing them to shelter among the tentacles that would spell death for most creatures their size. The anemone does not rely solely on nematocysts for defense. When threatened by a predator too large or immune to be deterred by stinging, some species employ additional tactics. They can retract their tentacles completely, closing up into a tight, unappetizing lump that offers little purchase for a predator's mouth. They can eject a contia, those thin defensive threads loaded with extra stinging cells, creating a cloud of irritation that might convince an attacker to seek easier prey elsewhere. They can even detach from their substrate and drift away on currents, reattaching elsewhere once danger has passed. Some anemones engage in combat with their own kind. When two individuals of certain species settle too close together, They may wage slow-motion territorial battles using specialized acrohagi. These inflatable fighting tentacles are particularly well armed with pneumatocysts and are used to strike neighboring anemones. The battles can last for hours or even days, with both participants pulsing their acrohagi back and forth, each trying to deliver enough stings to force their rival to relocate. One or both may sustain injuries. One may eventually withdraw, gliding slowly away to find less contested ground. The stinging cell, that explosive microscopic weapon, represents one of evolution's most successful innovations. It allowed the Cyndarean lineage to become effective predators despite lacking speed, strength, or complex nervous systems. It permitted sessile animals to hunt actively without moving from their chosen spots. It gave defense to creatures without armor, claws, or teeth, and it has persisted, fundamentally unchanged, for over 500 million years. Proof that when evolution hits upon something that works this well, it rarely sees reason to improve upon it. As the tentacles wave gently in the current, as the anemone waits patiently for the next unwary visitor, those hundreds of thousands of loaded weapons wait with it, silent, invisible, ready. If you were to swim along a tropical reef or explore a temperate tide pool, you would be struck immediately by the colors. Anemones glow in shades that seem impossible for animals without pigments, without fur, without feathers. Brilliant reds deeper than wine. Purples so rich they verge on black in certain lights. Greens that span from the palest seafoam to dark emerald. Blues that rival the clearest sky. Oranges like sunset. Yellows like daffodils. Some individuals display a single solid hue. Others show bands, stripes, spots, or gradients that shift subtly from column to tentacle tips. Some even exhibit different colors under different lighting conditions, responding to the spectrum and intensity of available light. The source of these colors is not always straightforward. In many species, particularly those living in shallow, sun-drenched waters, a significant portion of coloration comes not from the anemone itself, but from tiny algae living within its tissues. These single-celled dinoflagellates, called zooxanthella, reside by the millions in the anemone's gastrodermis, the inner cell layer. The zooxanthella are golden brown due to their photosynthetic pigments, and their collective presence can tint the anemone's body shades of brown, tan, or green. Different densities of zooxanthella create different intensities of color. An anemone that has lost its algal symbionts through stress or starvation may appear pale, translucent, almost ghostly compared to its normally colored counterparts. But zooxanthella alone do not explain the full spectrum. Many anemones produce their own pigments, proteins that absorb specific wavelengths of light and reflect others, creating the vivid hues we perceive. Some of these pigments serve protective functions, absorbing harmful ultraviolet radiation that could damage delicate tissues in shallow water. Others may help the anemone regulate light exposure for its photosynthetic partners, preventing too much light from overwhelming the algae and causing them to produce toxic oxygen radicals. Still others seem to serve no obvious function that scientists have yet discerned, leading to fascinating questions about why such diversity of color exists at all. The mystery deepens when we consider that anemones lack eyes capable of forming images. They can detect light intensity and even some wavelengths through simple photoreceptors scattered in their tissues, but they cannot see color as we understand it. They cannot admire their own vibrant hues or compare themselves to neighbors. If color serves a visual purpose, it must be aimed at other animals, but which ones, and why? One hypothesis suggests that bright colors might serve as warning signals, advertising to potential predators that these seemingly delicate flowers are armed with powerful stings. This would be aposematism, the evolutionary strategy employed by poison dart frogs and monarch butterflies, where bright coloration says, "Stay away, I am dangerous." Yet most fish that prey on anemones, like certain butterfly fish, don't seem deterred by color. They've evolved specialized feeding strategies that allow them to nip at tentacles from safe angles, color be damned. Another idea proposes that colors might attract prey. Certain hues could resemble flowers or other attractors that small fish and invertebrates approach, only to blunder into the waiting tentacles. Some anemones do seem to glow almost fluorescent in certain light conditions, particularly under the blue wavelengths that penetrate deeper into the ocean. This bioluminescent-like quality might serve as a lure, though direct evidence for this remains elusive. Still, another possibility is that colors play a role in communication with symbiotic partners. Clownfish, for instance, can see colors well and may use the anemone's hues to identify suitable host species. Since not all clownfish species pair with all anemone species, color could serve as a recognition signal, helping fish larvae select the right partner. But this doesn't explain coloration in anemone species that never host fish. The variation within single species adds another layer of mystery. Along certain coastlines, individuals of the snakelox anemone appear in two distinct color morphs, vibrant green with purple-tipped tentacles or dull gray-brown. These morphs can exist side by side in the same tide pool, experiencing identical environmental conditions. The difference seems related to zooxanthellae density and possibly genetics, but why both forms persist, what advantage each might have, remains unclear. You would think natural selection would favor one over the other if color truly mattered for survival, yet both endure. Some patterns make more functional sense. Anemones that camouflage themselves by attaching bits of shell, gravel, and detritus to their columns tend toward muted, neutral colors that help them blend into their surroundings. Deep-sea species living beyond the reach of sunlight often appear white, transparent, or pale pink, colors that make little difference in perpetual darkness. Arctic anemones trend toward reds and oranges, though the reason for this cold water coloration pattern is not fully understood. Certain colors change with circumstance. An anemone under stress, exposed to temperature extremes or chemical pollutants, may lose its vibrant hues as its zooxanthellae are expelled, and its pigment production falters. A well-fed, healthy specimen in ideal conditions may glow with saturated tones. Juveniles sometimes display different colors than adults of the same species, perhaps offering some advantage at different life stages. What we do know is that these colors make anemones spectacularly beautiful to human eyes. They add splashes of vibrant artistry to coral reefs and tide pools. They draw photographers and divers and curious children. They remind us that nature creates beauty without purpose. We can always discern that sometimes a mystery remains a mystery even as we admire it. Whether the colors warn, attract, protect, communicate, or serve functions we haven't yet imagined, they transform these simple animals into living gardens, into undersea flowers that pulse and sway with the rhythms of the ocean. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine that garden. Imagine the reds and purples, the greens and golds, the infinite variety of pattern and hue. Imagine them swaying gently in crystal water, catching filtered sunlight, painting the reef with living color. Let that image carry you deeper into rest. At first glance, a sea anemone appears permanently rooted to its spot on the reef or tide pool floor, attached, sessile, immobile, and for long stretches of time, this impression is accurate. An individual anemone might remain in the same square foot of substrate for months, even years, capturing prey that drifts within reach of its tentacles without ever needing to relocate. To the casual observer, they are as stationary as the rocks they cling to, but appearances deceive. Anemones can move. They do move. And when they do, the methods they employ are as diverse and unexpected as the creatures themselves. The most common form of anemone locomotion is gliding, a process so slow that time-lapse photography is often needed to make it visible to human perception. The anemone accomplishes this by carefully detaching small portions of its pedal disc while simultaneously securing other portions to new patches of substrate. Imagine trying to move while keeping one foot always planted. The anemone secretes fresh mucus ahead of the direction it wants to travel while releasing its grip from behind. Waves of muscular contraction pass through the pedal disc, similar to how a snail moves along a trail of its own slime. The entire body shifts forward incrementally, an inch, then another, over the course of hours, visible progress. Over the course of days, several feet. Over weeks, relocation to an entirely different section of reef. Why would an anemone undertake such a laborious journey? Resources, light, safety. An area that once provided abundant prey might see currents shift, reducing the flow of food particles. The anemone senses this change through declining capture rates and begins a slow migration toward richer feeding grounds. An anemone hosting photosynthetic zooxanthellae might move toward brighter light if shadows from growing corals begin blocking the sun. Conversely, it might retreat from excessive light if conditions become too intense. An individual harassed by a persistent predator or losing territorial battles with neighboring anemones might simply decide the local real estate is no longer worth defending. Some species employ more active locomotion methods. Gonactinia prolifera, a small anemone, can walk in a manner reminiscent of a measuring worm or caterpillar. It bends its column into a loop, bringing its tentacles down to touch the substrate ahead while the pedal disc remains anchored. The tentacles attach, the pedal disc releases, the column straightens, pulling the base forward. Then the cycle repeats. Tentacles reach, attach, pull, base releases, moves forward. This looping gait allows the anemone to cover ground more quickly than simple gliding, though it still takes considerable time to move any meaningful distance. Even more dramatic is swimming, an ability possessed by only certain species but spectacular when it occurs. Stomphia coccinea, the swimming anemone, demonstrates this behavior particularly well when threatened by its primary predator, certain species of sea stars. Upon contact with a sea star's tube feet, the anemone detaches completely from its substrate. Its tentacles begin thrashing in rapid rhythmic pulses. The entire column undulates, bending and flexing with desperate energy. These combined movements propel the anemone through the water in a frantic tumbling escape. The swimming is not graceful or controlled like a fish. It resembles more a mad flailing, a chaotic tumble through the water column, but it works. The anemone can put distance between itself and danger, eventually settling down in a new location far from the threat. Other species can detach and drift, allowing currents to carry them to new locations. This passive dispersal is not swimming in the active sense, but it achieves similar ends. The anemone releases its grip, inflates its body with water to increase buoyancy, and becomes a drifter in the ocean's currents. It may travel for hours or days before settling again, selecting a new patch of substrate by chance or by responding to chemical or physical cues it detects while drifting. Burrowing species demonstrate yet another form of movement. These anemones live in sand or mud rather than attaching to hard surfaces. Their pedal discs are modified into bulbous structures called physae that anchor them in soft sediment. When conditions warrant, they can use muscular contractions to work their way deeper into the substrate or to emerge more fully. The movement is slow, a gradual sinking or rising, but it allows them to adjust their exposure to currents, light, and potential predators. Perhaps most unexpected are the rolling anemones observed in the deep ocean. Scientists using submersibles in trenches miles below the surface have documented large anemones literally rolling along the seafloor. The anemone lies on its side and uses its tentacles to grip the sediment in a carefully coordinated sequence. Upper tentacles extend, attach, and pull, while lower tentacles release, creating a rotation that propels the animal forward in a slow tumble. This sideways movement, 90 degrees off the normal upright posture, allows the anemone to traverse the abyssal plane at a speed that, while glacially slow by most standards, is remarkably efficient for a deep-sea sessile animal searching for food or better positioning. Movement decisions appear to be driven by a combination of internal states and external stimuli. A starving anemone increases its locomotion rate, searching for better feeding opportunities. An anemone subjected to unfavorable water chemistry, temperature stress, or excessive sedimentation will relocate to escape the poor conditions. Competition with neighbors, particularly members of the same species encroaching on personal space, can trigger migration. Even the presence or absence of symbiotic partners influences movement. Some species with photosynthetic algae exhibit phototactic behavior, moving toward or away from light depending on the algae's needs and the anemone's current energy balance. The mechanisms underlying these movement decisions remain somewhat mysterious. The anemone lacks a centralized brain to process information and make calculated choices. Yet somehow its simple nerve net integrates sensory input: chemoreceptors detecting prey molecules in the water, mechanoreceptors sensing touch and water movement, photoreceptors monitoring light levels, and generates behavioral responses. Stay here, move this direction, swim away. The decentralized nervous system proves sufficient for these basic but crucial survival decisions. What strikes observers most about anemone movement is its patience. There is no rush, no panic, except in the rare swimming escape response, just slow, deliberate action undertaken when necessary and suspended when conditions are acceptable. The anemone embodies a kind of zen-like acceptance of its own pace, moving through a world that to it must seem frozen in time, where currents flow eternally and rocks stand unchanged for what might as well be forever. Yet within that slow existence, movement happens. Migration occurs. New territories are claimed and old ones abandoned. and the living gardens of the reef shift and rearrange themselves across time scales, humans rarely have the patience to observe. The ocean is not a solitary place. Even the most isolated coral head teams with interactions, relationships, partnerships that blur the lines between individuals and collectives. And nowhere are these partnerships more famous, more photographed, more captivating to human imagination than the relationship between sea anemones and clownfish. It is a friendship written into popular culture, immortalized in animated films, recognized even by people who have never seen a living reef. But the reality of this symbiosis goes deeper and stranger than simplified stories suggest. It is a relationship built on chemistry, immune manipulation, behavioral adaptation, and benefits that flow in multiple directions. Clownfish belong to the subfamily Amphipriinae, small, bold fish painted in bright oranges, yellows, blacks, and whites. 28 species exist, each with slightly different patterns, preferences, and personalities. But all share one common trait. They form obligate or facultative relationships with sea anemones. The fish take shelter among tentacles that would paralyze most creatures their size. They sleep there. They feed there. They raise their young there, gluing their eggs to rocks in the anemone's shadow where the stinging tentacles form a defensive perimeter. The question that fascinated scientists for decades was simple. Why don't the clownfish get stung? The anemone's nematocysts function perfectly well against other fish. Butterfly fish that nip at tentacles receive painful deterrence. Small damned shellfish that venture too close are captured and consumed. Yet clownfish dance through the tentacles with complete immunity, pressing their bodies against the anemone's oral disc, weaving between tentacles in what looks almost like affectionate nuzzling. For years, researchers debated the mechanism. The answer involves mucus. Clownfish are covered in a specialized mucus coating like all fish, a slime layer that protects them from pathogens, reduces friction while swimming, and serves various physiological functions. But clownfish mucus is different. When a clownfish first approaches an anemone, it performs a careful acclimation dance. The fish makes brief, tentative contacts with the tentacles, a light touch, a quick brush, never lingering long enough to trigger a major discharge of nematocysts, but enough to transfer chemical signals. With each touch, the fish picks up a bit of the anemone's own mucus. Gradually, sometimes over the course of hours or days depending on the species pairing, the clownfish incorporates these chemical markers into its own mucus coating. The result is molecular mimicry. The fish begins to smell chemically similar to the anemone itself. The anemone's nematocysts are programmed not to fire when they contact the anemone's own tissues, otherwise it would sting itself continuously. By adopting the anemone's chemical signature, the clownfish becomes invisible to those hair-trigger sensory mechanisms. The kinedorsals on the nematocysts detect self rather than other and remain inert. The fish has become, in a chemical sense, an extension of the anemone. Recent research reveals additional layers of complexity. Clownfish mucus contains unusually low levels of sialic acid, a sugar molecule that typically triggers nematocyst discharge in most fish. Anemones also lack sialic acid in their own mucus. This biochemical quirk makes clownfish poor targets for nematocyst activation even before they begin acquiring the anemone's mucus. The relationship appears to be a co-evolutionary partnership where both the anemone and the fish have adapted to facilitate each other's existence. But what do the partners gain? For the clownfish, the benefits are obvious. Protection from predators stands paramount. Larger fish that might make a meal of a clownfish learn quickly that pursuing prey into an anemone's tentacles results in painful stings and paralysis. The anemone becomes a fortress, a safe haven where the clownfish can retreat from danger. Studies show that clownfish with access to host anemones have significantly higher survival rates than those forced to live without this protection. The fish also benefit from food. Anemones are messy eaters. When they capture prey and draw it into their mouths, fragments escape. Bits of tissue, particles of broken shell, remnants of the meal drift away on currents. The clownfish dart in and harvest these scraps, gleaning nutrition from their host's leftovers. Some clownfish have even been observed deliberately feeding their host anemones, capturing prey and placing it directly into the tentacles or mouth, a behavior that suggests active partnership rather than simple parasitism. For the anemone, benefits are subtler, but real. The clownfish are fiercely territorial. They defend their host anemone aggressively against butterfly fish and other species known to nibble anemone tentacles. The fish dart out, chase off intruders, nip at fins, and generally make life miserable for anything that threatens their home. This protection from predation provides real value, particularly for anemones hosting multiple clownfish that can mount coordinated defenses. The fish also improve water circulation. Their constant movement, swimming in and around the tentacles, creates currents that bring fresh oxygen-rich water to the anemone's surface and carry away metabolic wastes. For an anemone that cannot move to escape stagnant conditions, this service enhances respiration and waste removal. Most surprisingly, the fish provide food directly, though not in the way you might expect. Clownfish waste products, ammonia-rich and nitrogen-laden, are excreted directly into the water surrounding the anemone. The anemone's tissues absorb these nutrients. But more importantly, the zooxanthellae living inside the anemone use nitrogen and ammonia as fertilizer. These algae perform photosynthesis, turning sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugars. The anemone receives some of these sugars, supplementing its diet. The fish's waste products directly fertilize the algae, increasing their productivity and therefore the nutritional benefits the anemone receives from its internal gardens. The whole arrangement creates a three-way partnership: fish, anemone, and algae, each supporting the others. Not all clownfish species can partner with all anemone species. The relationships are specific, though with some flexibility. Certain clownfish are generalists, capable of hosting with multiple anemone species. Others are specialists, found only with one or two particular partners. The magnificent sea anemone Heteractis magnifica hosts several clownfish species. The bubble-tip anemone Entacnonaire quadricolor is another popular host. The carpet anemones of the genus Sticodactyla form partnerships as well. But the giant green anemone of the Pacific, Anthopleura janthogrammica, rarely if ever hosts clownfish, despite being large and possessing functional tentacles. The formation of these partnerships begins early. Clownfish larvae float in the ocean's plankton for days or weeks after hatching. When they're ready to settle and transform into juveniles, they seek out anemones. Recognition cues remain somewhat mysterious, likely involving visual signals, chemical detection, and possibly the presence of adult clownfish already established in an anemone. The young fish must learn the acclimation dance, acquiring the protective mucus coating before they can settle permanently. Not all larvae succeed. Those that fail to find suitable hosts or that cannot complete acclimation successfully are unlikely to survive long in the competitive reef environment. Within an anemone hosting multiple clownfish, a strict social hierarchy develops. The largest individual is always the dominant female. The second largest is the breeding male. All others are non-breeding males held in a state of suppressed development. If the female dies or disappears, something remarkable happens. The breeding male undergoes sex change, transforming into the new breeding female. The largest of the non-breeders matures to become the new breeding male. This sequential hermaphroditism ensures that every anemone can support a breeding pair regardless of the random sex distribution of fish that settle there. The clownfish anemone partnership represents mutualism at its most visible and charismatic, but anemones form other relationships too. Hermit crabs of certain species seek out small anemones and place them on their shells. The anemone receives transportation, access to new feeding grounds as the crab moves about, and possibly scraps from the crab's meals. The crab gains camouflage and protection, as predators hesitant to attack a shell covered in stinging tentacles. When the hermit crab outgrows its shell and must move to a larger one, some species physically transfer their anemone companion to the new residence, a relocation service that benefits both partners. Some small shrimp and crabs live among anemone tentacles, protected by the same stinging cells that deter larger predators. These crustaceans have evolved their own resistance mechanisms, and they often clean the anemone in return, removing debris and parasites. Still other creatures use anemones as nurseries, laying their eggs in the shelter of tentacles that guard the developing young from harm. The symbiotic relationships extend even to the microscopic. Those zooxanthellae, the photosynthetic dinoflagellates living inside the anemone's tissues, represent one of the most important partnerships in shallow tropical seas. The algae receive shelter, access to sunlight, carbon dioxide from the anemone's respiration, and nitrogen from the anemone's waste. In return, they provide sugars and oxygen, sometimes contributing up to 90% of the anemone's nutritional needs in well-lit habitats. Without this partnership, many anemone species could not survive in nutrient-poor tropical waters where prey is scarce. The gardens within the garden, invisible cellular partners that make the visible partnership possible. This microscopic partnership functions through elegant biochemical exchange. During daylight hours, the zooxanthellae photosynthesize, converting carbon dioxide and water into glucose using the sun's energy. Much of this glucose leaks across cell membranes directly into the anemone's tissues, providing ready energy without the anemone having to digest anything. The anemone's metabolism produces carbon dioxide as a waste product which the algae eagerly consume, creating a perfect cycle. Nitrogen compounds from the anemone's digestion of prey, normally waste products, become fertilizer for the algae, boosting their productivity. The relationship becomes self-reinforcing, each partner enhancing the other's success in ways neither could achieve alone. These relationships remind us that life in the ocean is rarely about isolated individuals struggling alone. It is a web of dependencies, exchanges, and mutual benefits. The anemone, seemingly self-sufficient and solitary, is in fact a hub of interactions, a living nexus where multiple species meet, cooperate, and thrive together. As you imagine these partnerships playing out on a sunlit reef, as you picture the bright orange clownfish nestled safely among swaying tentacles, let the complexity of these connections fill you with wonder, and let that wonder carry you gently towards sleep. The sea anemone waits. This is the essence of its hunting strategy. No chasing, no stalking, no pursuit of fleeing prey, just patient presence, tentacles extended into the current like a net spread wide, counting on the ocean to deliver food directly into reach. It is a strategy that seems passive, almost lazy, yet it works. It has worked for hundreds of millions of years across every ocean on Earth. And the efficiency of this approach becomes clear when you consider the energy savings of never having to hunt, never having to swim, never having to do anything but wait and react when opportunity arrives. The anemone's diet consists primarily of small animals that blunder into its tentacles through accident or misfortune. Small fish, the most commonly depicted prey, definitely feature in the menu. Juvenile fish exploring the reef, small damsels or gobies swimming too close. Even larval fish drifting in the current can trigger the tentacles and find themselves paralyzed before they understand what happened. The stinging cells fire. The neurotoxins work within seconds. The helpless prey is guided mouthward by tentacles curling with slow purpose. But fish are far from the only items on the menu. Crustaceans provide substantial nutrition. Shrimp, small crabs, copepods, amphipods, any crustacean small enough to be subdued makes acceptable prey. The anemone's venom works particularly well on crustaceans, whose nervous systems prove especially sensitive to the toxins. A shrimp that makes contact with even a few tentacles typically goes limp almost instantly. The tentacles need not be long or numerous to be effective when the prey is so vulnerable to the venom. These crustaceans, with their jointed exoskeletons and rapid movements, make nutritious meals rich in protein and minerals that the anemone incorporates into its own growing tissues. The diversity of prey reflects the anemone's opportunistic nature. Whatever the ocean brings within reach becomes potential food. In tide pools, this might mean small periwinkle snails during high tide accidentally washing into tentacles while grazing on algae. On coral reefs, it could be juvenile parrotfish exploring the reef structure, or glass shrimp darting between corals at night. In sandflats, buried anemones might capture worms and tiny clams that venture too close to the hidden predator. Each habitat offers its own menu of potential prey, and the anemone samples from whatever selection the currents and circumstances provide. Mollusks appear in the diet too: small snails, juvenile clams, various tiny gastropods and bivalves wandering the reef at night risk capture if they venture too close to a hungry anemone. Even some worms, both free-swimming polychaetes and smaller benthic species, supplement the diet when other prey is scarce. Basically, anything small, mobile, and made of edible protein that touches those tentacles stands a good chance of becoming a meal. Larger species with longer, more numerous tentacles can capture bigger prey. Some of the giant carpet anemones can subdue fish several inches long if the fish makes full contact with a dense patch of tentacles. The sheer volume of nematocyst discharge from dozens of tentacles firing simultaneously can overwhelm even relatively large prey. Conversely, tiny anemones might feed primarily on zooplankton, microscopic crustaceans and larvae that drift through the water column, too small to see individually but abundant enough to provide sustenance when captured in sufficient quantities. The capture process, once triggered, unfolds with mechanical inevitability. Tentacles that made contact with the prey curl inward. Adjacent tentacles responding to chemical signals released by the wounded prey and mechanical signals from their neighbors also begin to curl and contract. The entire crown of tentacles often participates to some degree, creating a coordinated closing motion that draws the prey toward the central mouth. It's slow compared to the explosive strike of a mantis shrimp or the rapid gulp of a predatory fish, but the prey is in no condition to exploit that slowness. Paralyzed, barely breathing, if breathing at all, it can only endure the journey. Once the prey reaches the mouth, the anemone's lips, the edges of the oral disc, evert slightly to help guide the meal inward. The pharynx, that muscular throat region, begins peristaltic contractions, pulling the prey deeper into the gastrovascular cavity. Sometimes with larger prey, the process takes considerable time. The mouth stretches wider than seems possible for such a seemingly delicate animal. But remember, the anemone is mostly water, held rigid by hydrostatic pressure. That column can expand remarkably, when necessary. Prey items nearly as large as the anemone's entire oral disc can be swallowed, given enough time and effort. Inside the gastrovascular cavity, digestion begins. The mesenteries and gastric filaments secrete enzymes that break down proteins, fats, and other organic molecules. The process is extracellular, happening in the cavity itself rather than inside cells. As the prey's tissues dissolve, nutrients are absorbed through the gastrodermis lining the cavity. The mesenteries, with their vast surface area, maximize absorption. What cannot be digested, bones, shells, scales, other hard parts, accumulates in the cavity until the anemone eventually expels it. The same mouth that took in the meal now expels the waste. The anemone contracts its column, squeezes the gastrovascular cavity, and ejects the indigestible remains back out into the water. A little cloud of debris drifts away on the current. The cycle is complete. But not all anemones rely solely on heterotrophic feeding, capturing and eating prey. Many species, particularly those in shallow tropical waters, supplement their carnivorous diet with autotrophic nutrition from their zooxanthellae. These symbiotic algae, performing photosynthesis inside the anemone's tissues, produce sugars that the anemone absorbs. In optimal conditions, with bright light and healthy algae populations, some anemones may receive up to 90% of their energy needs from photosynthesis. They still eat prey when they can catch it, as prey provides essential nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that the algae cannot supply in sufficient quantities. But the majority of calories come from sunlight, processed through the algae and delivered directly into the anemone's cells. This dual feeding strategy provides remarkable flexibility. When prey is abundant, the anemone feeds actively, capturing meals and growing on the rich protein diet. When prey is scarce, the algae pick up the slack, providing energy from light. An anemone with healthy zooxanthellae can survive extended periods without catching prey, subsisting on photosynthetic products alone if necessary. This buffering against food scarcity helps explain why anemones hosting zooxanthellae can thrive in tropical waters where prey density is often lower than in colder, nutrient-rich seas. The relationship creates an interesting balance. Too much feeding on prey can reduce the anemone's dependence on its algae, potentially leading to lower algae populations. Too little prey over extended periods can stress the anemone, causing it to consume its own zooxanthellae for food, which weakens both partners. The optimal state maintains both food sources, heterotrophy and autotrophy, working together to sustain the partnership. Some anemones show feeding rhythms. They may extend their tentacles more fully during certain times of day when prey is more active. Nighttime, for instance, when many reef animals emerge to forage. Others remain constantly ready, tentacles always extended except when disturbed or digesting a particularly large meal. A few species can even retract completely when conditions are poor, closing up and waiting for better circumstances before resuming active feeding. The efficiency of the ambush strategy becomes clear when you consider the energy budget. The anemone expends minimal energy remaining attached and simply existing. No locomotion costs, no chase. The only significant energy expenditure comes from producing and maintaining nematocysts, which must be replaced after firing, and from the muscular work of digestion. But these costs are trivial compared to the energy demands of active hunting. An anemone can maintain its vigil for days or weeks between successful captures and still come out ahead energetically. And so the living garden feeds, silently, patiently, inevitable, as the tides. Small dramas of capture and consumption play out, unseen by most observers, as the reef goes about its business, and the anemones wait for their next meal to arrive on currents that never stop flowing. The sea anemone reproduces in ways that blur the lines between individual and colony, between parent and clone, between sexual and asexual, between death and transformation. Like many aspects of their biology, their reproductive strategies are diverse, opportunistic, and deeply tied to their environmental circumstances. Some methods are ancient, shared with their cnidarian cousins across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Others seem almost magical, abilities to regenerate and multiply that challenge our understanding of what it means to be a single organism. Sexual reproduction in anemones follows patterns both familiar and alien. Most species have separate sexes, distinct males and females, though you cannot tell them apart by looking at them. Their gonads, strips of reproductive tissue embedded in the mesenteries inside the gastrovascular cavity, produce either sperm or eggs depending on the individual's sex. Some species are hermaphrodites, producing both types of gametes, though usually not simultaneously. A few can even change sex over their lifetime, sequential hermaphrodites that switch from male to female or vice versa depending on environmental conditions or social dynamics. When conditions are right, typically keyed to seasonal cycles, water temperature, or lunar phases, the anemones release their gametes into the ocean. Males eject clouds of sperm through their mouths, milky streams that drift away on currents. Females follow, releasing eggs that they've nurtured inside their body cavities. Some species release eggs and sperm simultaneously in mass spawning events where hundreds of individuals coordinate their reproduction, filling the water with genetic material and hoping that chance meetings between egg and sperm will result in fertilization. In other species, fertilization happens internally. The female draws water containing sperm into her gastrovascular cavity through her mouth. Eggs are fertilized inside her body, developing through early stages in the relative safety of the parent's tissues. When the time comes, she expels the larvae through her mouth, broadcasting them into the water column to drift and develop on their own. The fertilized eggs develop into planular larvae, tiny ciliated creatures that look nothing like their eventual adult form. These planula are free-swimming, drifting in the ocean's plankton along with countless other larvae from countless other species. It is a perilous time. Most will be eaten. Most will drift into unsuitable habitat. Most will die before ever settling. But those that survive, that drift through the right currents to the right places, eventually sense cues telling them to settle. Chemical signals from suitable substrate, biofilms, perhaps the presence of other anemones, trigger the transformation. The planula sinks to the bottom. It attaches using adhesive secretions, and then metamorphosis begins. The ciliated larva transforms into a tiny polyp. Tentacles develop. The mouth forms. The gastrovascular cavity expands. Within days or weeks, a miniature anemone stands where a swimming larva once settled. From this point forward, it grows, slowly in most cases, but steadily, adding tissue and tentacles and size until it reaches sexual maturity years or even decades later, depending on the species. But sexual reproduction is only half the story. A sexual reproduction in anemones takes multiple forms, each fascinating in its own way. Perhaps the most dramatic is binary fission, where an anemone literally splits itself in two. This can happen longitudinally, down the long axis of the body, producing two anemones where one stood before, or it can happen transversely, across the column, creating a top half and bottom half that each regenerate their missing parts. The process takes hours or days. The anemone's tissues organize themselves. Internal structures duplicate, and then a cleft appears, slowly deepening until two separate individuals emerge, genetic clones, perfect copies. Pedal laceration represents another asexual strategy. As the anemone creeps slowly across the substrate on its pedal disc, small pieces of the disc's edge tear off and remain behind. These fragments, each containing a complete set of cells, including the regenerative stem cells needed to rebuild an entire organism, don't die. Instead, they round up, develop tentacles, form a mouth, grow a column, and become new tiny anemones. The parent continues on, leaving a trail of clonal offspring in its wake, each genetically identical but capable of growing into full-sized adults. Budding occurs in some species, where small buds develop on the column or pedal disc. These buds grow, differentiating into complete miniature anemones while still attached to the parent. Eventually, they detach and take up independent existence. The parent can produce multiple buds simultaneously, generating several offspring at once. These asexual methods allow rapid population growth when conditions are favorable. A single anemone can produce dozens or hundreds of clones over its lifetime, filling suitable habitat with copies of its successful genotype. This is particularly valuable in stable environments where the parent's genetics are well suited to local conditions. Why gamble on sexual reproduction and genetic recombination when your existing genome works perfectly well? Just copy it. But asexual reproduction has limitations. It produces no genetic diversity. All the clones share the same susceptibilities to disease, parasites, and environmental changes. If conditions shift, if a new predator appears, if water chemistry alters, an entire clonal population might fail simultaneously because they're all genetically identical. Sexual reproduction by mixing genes from two parents creates offspring with varied traits, some of which might by chance prove better suited to changed conditions. Most anemones employ both strategies opportunistically. When stressed, starving, or in poor conditions, they may reproduce asexually, creating clones without the energy investment required for game production. When well-fed, healthy, and in stable conditions, they invest in sexual reproduction, creating genetically diverse larvae that can colonize new habitats. This flexible approach maximizes reproductive success across varying circumstances. Some species show remarkable regenerative abilities beyond reproduction. Cut an anemone into several pieces, and under the right conditions, each piece may regenerate into a complete individual. Remove tentacles, and new ones grow back. Damage the column, and it repairs. This regenerative capacity, shared with other cnidarians like hydras, approaches what we might call biological immortality in some species. As long as the cells remain intact and conditions support life, the anemone can rebuild itself indefinitely. This regenerative power raises fascinating questions about aging and identity. When an anemone splits through fission, which half is the original? When it drops pedal lacerates that grow into new anemones, did the parent reproduce or did it fragment itself? When regeneration replaces every cell in the body over time, is it still the same individual? These questions don't trouble the anemone, but they challenge our understanding of individuality, especially in organisms that lack the centralized nervous systems and defined boundaries we associate with animal identity. Growth rates vary by species, temperature, food availability, and light levels for those with zooxanthellae. Some species reach sexual maturity within a year or two. Others require 5, 10, even 20 years before they're large enough to reproduce. But once mature, they can continue reproducing for decades, potentially centuries, showing no signs of senescence, no decline in reproductive capacity with age. This reproductive longevity, combined with their asexual multiplication abilities, makes anemones remarkably successful at maintaining populations despite their sedentary lifestyle and the challenges of life in a competitive ocean environment. And so the gardens perpetuate themselves, through sex and asexuality, through larvae and clones, through regeneration and renewal. The ancient line continues, passing genetic information and cellular organization forward into new generations that will in turn anchor themselves to rocks and wait for the currents to bring food, mates, and the slow passage of time that seems to mean so little to creatures that may not age at all. Perhaps nothing about sea anemones inspires more wonder than their longevity. These soft-bodied invertebrates, seemingly delicate, lacking protective shells or sophisticated organ systems, can live longer than trees, longer than elephants, longer than humans. Individual anemones documented in aquariums have survived 80 years in captivity. Scientists estimate wild specimens of certain species may reach 150 years or more. Some researchers suspect that in ideal conditions free from predation and disease, certain anemones might not age at all in the traditional sense, their lifespans limited only by accident rather than any internal biological clock counting down to inevitable death. This extraordinary longevity places anemones among a rare group of organisms described as negligibly senescent. Senescence is the biological term for aging, the gradual deterioration of function over time that affects most animals. Cells accumulate damage, organs decline, reproductive capacity wanes, cancer risk increases. Eventually, the organism dies even in the absence of disease or predation, simply because its biological systems fail. But some organisms show little or no senescence. They do not deteriorate with age. They do not become more likely to die as years pass. They maintain reproductive capacity indefinitely. Anemones belong to this exclusive club. How do they achieve this apparent immunity to aging? The answer involves multiple biological mechanisms working together. First, telomeres. These are protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, similar to the plastic tips on shoelaces. Every time a cell divides, its telomeres shorten slightly. After many divisions, the telomeres become too short to protect the chromosome, and the cell can no longer divide. This is one of the fundamental mechanisms of aging in many organisms. But anemones, like their coral relatives, appear to have methods of maintaining or repairing their telomeres. Enzymes called telomeres can rebuild telomere length, effectively resetting the cellular clock. Endomeres may produce these enzymes continuously, preventing the telomere erosion that limits other animals' lifespans. Second, DNA repair. All organisms accumulate mutations and DNA damage over time from radiation, oxidative stress, and copying errors during cell division. Usually this damage accumulates until it impairs cellular function. But studies of anemone genomes reveal very low mutation rates in genes that mutate rapidly in other animals. This suggests anemones have exceptionally efficient DNA repair mechanisms, catching and fixing errors before they can accumulate into functional problems. Third, cellular renewal. Anemones can replace damaged or dying cells continuously throughout their lives. They maintain populations of stem cells, undifferentiated cells capable of becoming any cell type the anemone needs. When a tentacle is damaged, stem cells divide and differentiate to repair it. When cells in the gastrodermis die, they're replaced. This constant cellular turnover means an old anemone may not contain many cells that are actually old. Most of its cells may be relatively young even if the individual organism has existed for a century. Fourth, cancer resistance. Most long-lived animals face increasing cancer risk with age, as accumulated mutations eventually produce cells that divide uncontrollably. But anemones seem remarkably resistant to tumor formation. The mechanisms behind this resistance remain under investigation, but it likely relates to their efficient DNA repair and their relatively simple body plan, which may limit opportunities for cancerous growth to gain a foothold. Fifth, metabolic stability. Some animals age quickly because their high metabolic rates generate oxidative stress that damages cells. Anemones, being sedentary and relying partly on photosynthesis for nutrition in many species, may have lower metabolic demands and therefore accumulate oxidative damage more slowly. Their symbiotic zooxanthellae may even help by producing antioxidants that protect both the algae and the anemone's tissues. These mechanisms combine to create organisms that can persist for extraordinary spans of time. There are documented cases of individual anemones being observed and studied for decades. A giant green anemone named Mr. Tony, so nicknamed by a marine biologist who fed it for years, lived at Duxbury Reef off the California coast and may still live there decades later. Aquarium specimens of the magnificent sea anemone have survived 80 years in captivity and showed no signs of senescence when they eventually died of accidents or diseases rather than old age. But longevity varies between species. Some smaller species may live only a few years. Bartholomea annulata, for instance, typically survives only 1.5 to 2 years in the wild. Environmental conditions also influence lifespan. Anemones in harsh environments with variable temperatures, high predation, or frequent disturbance obviously face more mortality than those in stable, protected habitats. But in optimal conditions, large temperate or tropical species can become truly ancient beings. What does it mean for an anemone to live a century or more? It means an individual can witness changes in its reef environment across timescales that dwarf human perception. It can see storms reshape the substrate, see coral colonies grow and die around it, see fish species come and go with shifting climate patterns. It can outlive countless generations of the fish that shelter in its tentacles. It can persist through pollution events, temperature fluctuations, and other disturbances that kill shorter-lived neighbors. This longevity provides stability in reef ecosystems, creating permanent shelter and hunting grounds that other organisms can depend on across their entire lifespans. An anemone that has lived for a century has experienced the ocean through all its moods. It has felt the gentle caress of summer currents carrying warm water and abundant plankton. It has endured winter storms that scour the reef and test the strength of its pedal disc's grip on the rock. It has survived the lean times when prey becomes scarce and the body must rely more heavily on symbiotic algae for sustenance. It has thrived during abundant periods when fish are plentiful and every day brings new meals. Through all of this, through the cycles of plenty and scarcity, storm and calm, the anemone endures, its tissues continuously renewing themselves, its cells perpetually young even as the organism itself accumulates decades and centuries of existence. The potential for biological immortality, the idea that some anemones might not age at all and could theoretically live forever if not killed by external causes, remains a subject of active research. The evidence suggests at minimum that age-related decline is minimal or absent in some species. An anemone at 100 years old is functionally similar to one at 20 years old, assuming similar size and conditions. This challenges our understanding of what aging is and why it occurs, raising questions about whether senescence is truly universal among complex animals, or whether it's merely one possible outcome that most species evolved but a few avoided. For creatures living such long lives, the world must appear almost static. Seasons pass like days, decades like years. The slow creep of geological and ecological change becomes perceptible. They are witnesses to deep time, living books recording the history of their particular patch of reef or tide pool across spans that blur into the threshold of immortality. As you rest tonight, imagine that existence. Imagine sensing the world from a time scale so expanded that patience becomes not a virtue but simply the nature of being. Let that peaceful, unhurried timelessness settle over you. Let it slow your thoughts and quiet your mind as sleep draws closer. The world's oceans harbor more than 1,000 described species of sea anemones, with scientists suspecting hundreds more await discovery in poorly explored deep-sea habitats. This diversity manifests in staggering variety. Anemones range from specimens smaller than a fingernail, tiny polyps barely visible without magnification, to giants exceeding 6 feet across with tentacles that could engulf a human hand. They inhabit every ocean, every depth zone, every temperature regime where liquid water exists and enough nutrients flow to sustain carnivorous life. Size variation is perhaps most immediately striking. The smallest anemones, like some members of the genus Edwardia, measure mere millimeters in diameter and length. These tiny burrowers hide in sand, extending their diminutive tentacles to capture microscopic prey. At the other extreme lie the carpet anemones, particularly Stichodactyla mertensi and Heteractis magnifica, which can exceed 1 meter, roughly 3 feet, in diameter. The giant green anemones Anthopleura xanthogrammica can stretch to similar dimensions when fully expanded. These massive individuals bear hundreds of tentacles and can capture prey as large as small fish, engulfing them in a crown of stinging appendages that might span wider than a basketball. Between these extremes lies the majority of species, measuring anywhere from 1 to 5 inches in diameter when expanded. The familiar beadlet anemone Actinia equina, common in European tide pools, typically measures about 2 inches across. The strawberry anemone Coronactis californica, which technically isn't a true sea anemone but a related coral, forms dense colonies of individuals each about an inch in diameter, creating carpets of red, pink and white polyps on Pacific rocky reefs. Body shape varies as dramatically as size. Some species sport thick, stumpy columns barely taller than they are wide. Others extend thin, elongated columns that can stretch to a foot or more in length while maintaining diameters of only an inch or 2. The column surface ranges from smooth and glistening to covered with tubercles, papillae, or adhesive structures. The plumous anemone Metridium senile bears a tall column topped with hundreds of fine, feathery tentacles that give it a distinctly fluffy appearance. The dahlia anemone Urticina felina covers its column with shells and gravel, camouflaging itself so completely that it resembles a pile of debris more than a living animal. Tentacle number, arrangement and morphology provide another axis of variation. Some species bear as few as a dozen tentacles, others, particularly larger specimens, may boast hundreds or even thousands. Tentacles can be short and stubby, long and flowing, thick or thread-like, smooth or beaded. The bubble-tip anemone Entacmaya, quadricolor, earns its name from the bulbous swellings at the tips of its tentacles, structures whose function remains incompletely understood but may relate to light capture for symbiotic algae. The snake-lox anemone Anemonia viridis has tentacles that cannot fully retract, giving it a permanently extended flowing appearance even when disturbed. Habitat preferences fragment the diversity further. Shallow water species colonize the intertidal zone, enduring exposure to air during low tides, dramatic temperature fluctuations, and battering waves. These hardy species must tolerate desiccation, closing up into tight balls of muscle that retain moisture until the tide returns. Subtidal species living always submerged in relatively stable conditions can be more delicate, relying on consistent water coverage rather than tolerance of extremes. Tropical species generally prefer warm waters between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, thriving on sun-drenched coral reefs where their symbiotic zooxanthellae photosynthesize efficiently. Many of the largest and most colorful species inhabit these warm seas. Temperate species occupy cooler waters from the Mediterranean to the North Atlantic to the Pacific coasts of North America. Some thrive in cold water, in Arctic and subarctic seas, where temperatures barely rise above freezing. These cold water species often grow more slowly but may achieve impressive longevity as the cold water slows metabolism and reduces the rate of biological processes, including aging. Deep-sea anemones represent perhaps the most alien members of the order. Living thousands of feet below the surface, beyond the reach of sunlight, these species can reach enormous sizes despite inhabiting nutrient-poor environments. Some anchor themselves to rock outcrops on seamounts or mid-ocean ridges. Others burrow in soft sediment on the abyssal plain. A few have been discovered at the very deepest accessible points in the ocean, beyond 30,000 feet, in trenches where the pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres. These anemones have never experienced light, have never hosted zooxanthellae, and feed solely on the sparse rain of organic debris falling from the surface miles above or on the occasional animal that ventures within reach of their tentacles. Substrate preferences add yet more diversity. Most species attach to hard surfaces: rock, coral, shell, timber, metal, concrete. Pretty much any solid substrate will suffice. But burrowing species prefer sand or mud, extending just their oral disc and tentacles above the sediment surface while their column and pedal disc remain buried. These species often have specialized morphology, with elongated columns and modified pedal discs called physae that anchor them deep in soft bottoms. A few species are free-living, unattached to any substrate. These drifters float in the water column, or periodically detach and reattach as they're carried by currents. Some hitchhike on other animals, forming commensal or mutualistic relationships. The anemone Calliactis parasitica specifically associates with hermit crabs, being placed on the crab's shell and carried around as a living defense system. When the crab changes shells, it often transfers its anemone to the new home, maintaining the partnership. Color morphs within single species create additional confusion and wonder. As mentioned earlier, the snake-lox anemone appears in green and brown forms. The aggregating anemone Anthopleura elegantissima displays variation in color depending on which symbiotic alga it hosts, ranging from green to pink to brown. Some individuals of normally colorful species occasionally appear as pale or white morphs lacking typical pigmentation. Whether these represent genetic variants, environmental responses, or diseased individuals remains debated in many cases. Geographic distribution patterns show that while some species are cosmopolitan, found in oceans worldwide, others are strict endemics, restricted to single coastlines or even single reefs. The magnificent sea anemone ranges across the Indo-Pacific from the Red Sea to French Polynesia, a distribution spanning thousands of miles. Conversely, some species described from particular locations have never been found anywhere else, raising questions about whether they're truly endemic or simply undersampled. The deep ocean in particular remains largely unexplored, and every major deep-sea expedition discovers new anemone species in trenches and on seamounts that have never seen human eyes before. Scientists estimate we've likely documented only a fraction of the total anemone diversity that exists on Earth, with hundreds of species remaining to be discovered in the vast unexplored reaches of our ocean planet. Each new species adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how these ancient animals have diversified across every marine habitat. Behavioral diversity matches morphological variation. Some species are fiercely territorial, engaging in chemical and physical warfare with neighbors using specialized combat tentacles called acrohagi. These battles can last for hours, with both participants striking at each other until one retreats and relocates to less contested territory. Others tolerate close contact, forming dense aggregations where hundreds of individuals cluster together in what appears to be peaceful coexistence, their tentacles sometimes touching without triggering aggressive responses. Some are active, moving frequently in response to environmental conditions, searching for optimal light, temperature, or feeding locations. Others remain utterly sessile, potentially staying in the same spot for years or decades, becoming as permanent a feature of their reef as the rock they're attached to. A few have evolved swimming as an escape response, thrashing wildly when threatened. Most never swim a stroke in their lives, content to remain anchored and let the world come to them rather than venture into the unknown waters beyond their chosen home. This extraordinary diversity, this radiation into 1,000 forms and strategies, all built on the same fundamental body plan of tentacled polyp, testifies to the success of the anemone design. It can be scaled up or down, modified for different habitats, specialized for particular prey, partnered with different symbionts, colored to blend in or stand out. But through all these variations, the core remains the same: pedal disc, column, oral disc, tentacles, sting egg, cells, incomplete gut, simple nerve net. The anemone in miniature or gigantic, tropical or polar, shallow or abyssal, carries this ancient architecture forward, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions remain the best ones even as diversity blooms around that stable core. And now, as we drift toward the deepest waters of this journey, let us consider the anemone's place in the larger fabric of ocean life. These living gardens do more than simply exist. They shape their environments. They provide structure on otherwise barren surfaces, creating habitat for dozens of other species. The California mussel beds of the Pacific coast are not just mussels. They're complex communities where aggregating anemones fill the spaces between shells, creating hiding spots for juvenile crabs, small fish, brittle stars, and countless other creatures. The anemones become the foundation species, organisms whose presence fundamentally alters the habitat and enables other species to thrive. On coral reefs, large anemones create microhabitats. The shelter they provide to clownfish extends by proxy to whatever those fish interact with. The nutrients they cycle through feeding and excretion become available to other organisms. Their bodies host yet more creatures: tiny crustaceans too small to see without magnification, specialized worms, even parasitic copepods. An individual anemone is not just an individual but an ecosystem, a living structure supporting a community. They play roles in nutrient cycling, taking up nitrogen and phosphorus from prey and waste, processing it through their bodies and their symbiotic algae, and releasing it back into the environment in forms usable by other organisms. They contribute to benthic pelagic coupling, that critical connection between the seafloor and the water column, capturing plankton drifting in the current and converting it into biomass that then becomes available to benthic predators and scavengers when the anemone itself is eaten or dies. They serve as indicators of environmental health, because many species are sensitive to water quality, temperature, and chemical conditions. Their presence or absence can signal ecosystem changes. The loss of anemones from a historically occupied area might indicate pollution, warming, or other stressors. Conversely, their persistence suggests conditions remain within tolerable ranges. Their symbiotic songfale make them vulnerable to bleaching, just like corals, during heat stress events. Monitoring anemone health thus contributes to broader understanding of reef ecosystem status. For humans, anemones provide aesthetic and educational value. They draw divers and tide pool explorers, inspiring wonder and curiosity. They teach us about symbiosis, about alternative body plans, about longevity and regeneration. They offer potential medical applications, as their venoms contain compounds that might yield new pharmaceuticals. Researchers study actinotoxins, isolated from Anemone nematoxys, investigating their potential as pain medications, anti-cancer agents, and tools for neuroscience research. The chemical sophistication of these venoms, evolved over hundreds of millions of years to incapacitate specific prey efficiently, represents a library of bioactive molecules with potential human applications. Yet anemones face threats. Collection for the aquarium trade has impacted some populations, particularly in areas where desirable species like bubble tips and carpet anemones are harvested from the wild rather than propagated in captivity. While anemones can reproduce asexually and potentially recover from harvesting pressure, removal of large reproductive adults before they spawn can reduce genetic diversity and slow population recovery. Habitat destruction, particularly dynamite fishing and coastal development that destroys rocky substrate or buries sediments, eliminates suitable habitat for many species. Climate change poses perhaps the greatest long-term threat. Warming waters stress anemones just as they stress corals, potentially causing bleaching events where symbiotic zooxanthellae are expelled. Ocean acidification makes it harder for the few anemone species that do secrete protective structures to maintain those structures. Changes in current patterns and upwelling can alter food availability. Sea level rise, while less directly threatening to anemones than to terrestrial organisms, still affects intertidal species by changing exposure times and wave energy. Pollution, from agricultural runoff to plastic microfibers, impacts anemones whose filtering feeding exposes them to whatever contaminants exist in the water. Heavy metals bioaccumulate. Pesticides and pharmaceuticals affect physiological processes. Even sunscreen chemicals washed off swimmers in popular snorkeling spots have been shown to cause stress in anemones and other cnidarians. Despite these pressures, anemones persist. Their longevity provides buffer against temporary disturbances. Their reproductive flexibility allows rapid recolonization when conditions improve. Their wide distribution means local extinctions don't threaten most species globally. But this resilience has limits. Some rare endemics exist in such restricted ranges that a single catastrophic event could eliminate them. And even common species can be pushed beyond their tolerance if stresses intensify or combine. Protecting anemones means protecting their habitats. Marine protected areas that prohibit destructive fishing and limit development give anemone populations space to thrive. Water quality standards that reduce pollution inputs maintain conditions these animals evolved to tolerate. Climate action that limits warming and acidification gives anemones and their symbiotic algae a fighting chance to adapt. Aquaculture programs that breed popular aquarium species in captivity reduce pressure on wild populations. Education that helps people understand these animals' roles in ocean ecosystems builds support for conservation. The anemone asks nothing of us. It simply exists, has existed, will exist if we allow it, anchored to the substrate and waiting for the current to bring food. It doesn't know we study it, photograph it, write about it, try to protect it. It just is. A polyp, a hunter, a garden, a partnership. A testament to the power of simplicity persisted across deep time. A reminder that life takes forms stranger and more wonderful than we often remember to notice. And now, as this journey through the living gardens reaches its end, as the tide of consciousness ebbs and pulls you towards sleep, take a moment to reflect. You've traveled through time tonight, back hundreds of millions of years to meet ancestors of beings that still live today. You've explored anatomy stranger than fiction, stinging cells that fire faster than thought, colors we cannot explain, partnerships that blur boundaries between species. You've witnessed movement so slow it seems like stillness, feeding strategies built on patience, reproduction that confounds our categories, and lifespans that approach immortality. You've met beings that are animals yet live like plants, predators that wait instead of hunt, creatures that can split themselves and each half lives on, organisms that host gardens inside themselves and form friendships with fish. You've descended into the deepest trenches and drifted through the shallowest tide pools. You've seen 1,000 species bloom from a single ancient design. The sea anemone reminds us that the ocean is not just water. It is a living tapestry woven from millions of threads, each one a species, each species a collection of individuals pursuing survival in ways as diverse as the imagination of evolution itself. And among those threads, the anemone stands out, bright and soft and patient, a flower that stings, a garden that hunts, an ancient being that refuses to age. Tonight as you sleep, you carry a little of that ocean with you. The iron in your blood was forged in stars and processed through the food chain that begins with photosynthesis in algae and flows through creatures like anemones. The water in your cells responds to the same physical laws that let anemones maintain their shape with hydrostatic skeletons. The neurons in your brain, though vastly more complex, share ancestry with the simple nerve nets that let anemones sense and respond to their world. You are, in a very real sense, part of the same family as the anemone, a distant cousin, separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, but family nonetheless. Both of you descended from the same ultimate ancestors in the ancient seas, both of you products of the same chemical and physical laws playing out across deep time. Both of you for this moment, alive and present in a universe that permits and perhaps encourages complexity to bloom from simplicity. So rest now. Let the ocean's rhythms carry you into sleep. Let the image of swaying tentacles and pulsing columns fill the space behind your eyes. Let the colors wash over you, purples and greens and oranges and blues. Let the ancient patience of beings that can wait a century for conditions to improve settle into your bones and slow your racing thoughts. Let the partnerships, the symbioses, the mutual dependencies remind you that you too are not alone, that you too are part of networks and communities and relationships that sustain and define you. The anemones will still be there tomorrow. They'll still be there next year. Many of them will still be there long after you and I have returned to the elements. They anchor the gardens of the reef, patient and persistent, asking nothing, giving shelter and beauty and complexity to the ocean they've called home since before the first vertebrate drew breath. Sleep well. Dream of gardens beneath the waves. Dream of colors and stings and partnerships. Dream of time measured not in years, but in centuries. Dream of the ocean, that vast blue realm that gave birth to life and still nurtures it in forms beyond counting. And when you wake, perhaps you'll remember that somewhere in the world right now, anemones are swaying in the current, tentacles extended, waiting patiently as they've waited for 500 million years, as they'll wait for 500 million more if we give them the chance. Thank you for joining this journey into the gardens of the reef. Thank you for your curiosity and your willingness to learn about creatures that don't demand attention but richly reward it when given. If you found this restful, if it helped you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into the deep blue unknown. The ocean is vast, its secrets are many, and we've only just begun to explore them together. But for tonight, this is enough. The anemones have shared their stories, the gardens have opened their gates, and sleep is waiting. Gentle as a tide pool at dawn, warm as sunlit shallows, deep as the abyssal plains where ancient polyps glow in the dark. Rest now. The ocean will be here when you wake, and so will the anemones, those living gardens, those patient hunters, those timeless beings that teach us that sometimes the simplest forms are the most enduring, that beauty needs no complexity, and that waiting, simply waiting, can be a strategy as successful as any the evolutionary process has ever devised. Good night, sleep deeply, and dream of the gardens beneath the waves.